All right, world, we're back with another Facebook Live on Friday afternoon. You've got a real privilege, or really, I have the privilege because we get to do this with your two directors of analysis. Adriano, how's it going on Friday?
Hey, nice to talk with you again. We haven't done these in a very long time, at least not you and I together.
No, I'm super excited. And to that end, we're going to be talking all things Europe today, obviously near and dear to your heart. And we're going to start out certainly in Germany because that's kind of the trigger for this discussion. Chancellor Scholz gave this big speech. Can you kind of tee up what he was talking about, Adriano?
Yeah, he gave a big speech in Prague. You know that the Czech Republic is holding the temporary presidency of the European Union. And he basically outlined his views for European integration, for the future of the European Union. In a way, it kind of echoed a big speech that French President Emmanuel Macron gave at the Sorbonne University in Paris in 2017. Scholz has been chancellor for less than a year, and he really didn't have the chance to outline his views for Europe. He basically said that if the European Union wants to incorporate new member states, and there's a lot of candidates in the Western Balkans, Ukraine, even Georgia, then it should do things like reduce the number of parliamentarians in the European Parliament or streamline the decision-making process. Because, of course, it's already very complicated to make decisions when you have 27 member states. It's going to be even harder when you have 30, 33. Scholz even said 36. And probably the most interesting thing that he said was that in order to streamline the decision-making process, the European Union should get rid of the principle of unanimity, which is the principle that it uses to make really big decisions. And I'm talking about foreign policy, like imposing sanctions on other countries, or accepting new member states, or reforming the tax system. So really, really big, sensible decisions that right now are taken using unanimity, which means that the 27 member states have to be in agreement. Every individual member state has veto power, and they use that veto power very often. And to make things even more frustrating, sometimes they use that veto power to obtain concessions in areas that are not even connected to the main issue under discussion. Like you want some extra funds for whatever, and you're vetoing a decision on, I don't know, foreign policy. So they try to use that leverage as much as they can. And we have seen countries like Poland, Hungary, but even others threatening or in some cases even using that veto power. So Scholz said we need to replace unanimity. We need to have qualified majority voting, because otherwise this is going to become too cumbersome, too difficult to govern. And our rivals, China, Russia, to some extent even the US, are much more cohesive. We need to be faster at making decisions.
Well, Adriano, speaking here in the U.S., I won't make a comment on whether or not we're more cohesive, but certainly the rivals in China and Russia make sense. I mean, what you're laying out here, it's very kind of like theoretical and high-minded strategic, but it actually has like real tactical implications for kind of how the EU does foreign policy. I mean, I'm thinking most specifically and recently about sanctions against Russia. I mean, exactly what you laid out, just getting some of these to pass all 27 members was incredibly difficult. It only came after those exact concessions were given. And there's obviously been a lot of press about how going forward, further sanctions seem all but impossible because we've kind of reached the limit of what all the members are able to agree on.
You are absolutely correct. We saw in the latest package of sanctions where the European Union targeted Russia's oil exports. They needed support from the 27 member states. And the Hungarian government was, well, we are very dependent on Russian oil. We can't tolerate this. This will do significant damage to our economy. We will veto the entire thing unless we are giving an exemption from the sanctions. So in a typical European way, they kind of found a compromise. They said, okay, most of us are going to do this. Hungary and a few others, you are going to be given more time to save face and to try to at least have most of the member states approving the sanctions, but this was a reminder of the power that individual member states have. And there is another very interesting case. There is an ongoing project, and there is some cooperation between the European Union and the United States to change the way that big corporations are taxed. There is this idea of introducing like a minimum corporate tax across the West. There's this idea of taxing big digital companies in the places where they actually make the money and not so much in the places where they have their headquarters. And Poland is so far slowing a decision on this because they have a different argument with the European Commission over the rule of law and the state of the judiciary in Poland. And Brussels is threatening to not to deliver recovery funds to Warsaw, and Warsaw is, in retaliation, vetoing a tax issue that has nothing to do with their dispute. So these are all reminders of just how concrete the implications of unanimity voting have for the decision-making process in the EU.
I mean, it certainly reminds me a lot of similar things that we see in U.S. Congress, where currently, Democrats, for instance, have such tenuous control over, say, the Senate, that one or two senators really has this inordinate amount of power. And there's similar debates over whether we should be reforming our voting rules. You wrote this super interesting column that we published earlier this week, laying out what you called kind of the unanimity trap. So if we were going to ditch unanimity according to Scholz's proposal, what would that look like, and what would the risks then be?
Yeah, it's interesting because the defenders of unanimity, they say, well, this is an insurance policy for small member states. If you don't have that leverage, if you don't have that veto power, then it's going to be France and Germany calling the shots, and small Estonia or Slovakia or Croatia just having to grin and bear it, So it's seen that many small members of the European Union see this as an insurance policy. It's their last line of defense whenever they need to protect their national interests. So you have this very fascinating debate between the big states, your Germanys and your Frances and your Italy, saying we need to be faster at making decisions because our rivals certainly are. But then you have the small member states saying, yeah, but what about representation? What about democracy? What about our tiny countries and their interests? So it's a fascinating debate. And in the opinion piece that I wrote a few days ago, I am using a term that I used a few years ago, which is the unanimity trap, right? Because in order to change the voting mechanism, in order to replace unanimity with qualified majority decision, you actually need unanimity because you need to reform.
By the way, that's the most European thing that's been said.
You need to reform the treaties, and to reform the treaties, you need unanimity. So I think it's very unlikely that small member states would actually approve a reform process that could result in the replacement of that insurance policy that I was describing before with something that, in their opinion, will benefit the bigger member states.
I mean, I would certainly agree. But what I found super interesting in your column was that you kind of went through this thought experiment of, okay, let's say, even if they overcome this challenge and they replace unanimity with qualified majority in these cases, there's a lot of risks that rather than actually benefiting the EU, this could actually be almost kind of a direct threat to its very cohesion. Can you walk us through that a little more?
Yeah, what I wrote in the column is that because I do not think the European Union will be able to exit the unanimity trap, I honestly don't think there will be treaty change, and I honestly don't think that they will change the voting mechanism anytime soon. Because this won't happen, the European Union will have to get a bit more creative about ways to circumvent the voting mechanism. In some cases, they will change the legal nature of the issue under discussion and say, well, this is not a tax issue that needs to be voted using unanimity. This is a competition issue that could be voted using qualified majority. In other cases, they will use a legal tool that they have, which is called enhanced cooperation, which means that some member states are allowed to deepen the process of integration, to move forward with the federalization of the European Union, while others are given more time to eventually catch up. For instance, this is the way that the European Union created the Eurozone. You know that the EU has 27 member states, but only 19 of them use the euro as their national currency. The rest of them have promised to eventually join, but it's taking time. So I think that to circumvent the unanimity trap, the EU will continue and probably accelerate the use of these mechanisms. So on the plus side, I would say that the positive, if you like, aspect of this is that the EU will be able to make decisions faster. The problem is that it will not be the entire European Union. It will be the bunch of countries, the smaller group of countries that actually moves forward with integration of their militaries, with the integration of their fiscal systems, and so on. So on the plus side, there is that. The problem is that, A, we are no longer talking about the EU 27. We are talking about a smaller group of countries. B, this will only work if eventually the opt-outs or the countries that are left behind eventually join the main group of countries integrating further, because otherwise you will have a very piecemeal process of integration in which some countries will be doing their own stuff, other countries will be doing their own stuff. It will be a mess. It will be chaotic. It will be legally impossible to govern, and you will end up doing the exact opposite thing that you set out to do. Instead of moving faster with the decision-making process, you will have so many different and even conflicting pockets of integration that it will be a mess, it will be dysfunctional, and nothing will get done.
And the real irony that kind of sticks out from me there is that kind of in this quest to try to catch up with, say, rivals like China or Russia that have more centralized states that can make faster decisions, if they were to pursue some of these programs, you're basically allowing a whole number of states that could be proverbially kind of like picked off by China and Russia, influenced, and you ultimately have a European Union rather than being more cohesive and kind of proactive is actually a lot weaker.
Yeah, exactly. The more internally fragmented the European Union is, the easier it will be for external powers to interfere with domestic EU politics. So if you see your rival, and this is how Russia certainly and China to some extent sees the European Union, if you see your rival internally divided, if you see that your rival is a mess, if you see that your rival is a patchwork of very different interests and very different projects of integration that do not have a lot of coherence, then that's an opening for you. That's an opportunity for you to disrupt, interfere, even bribe. So it's a very tricky situation because, as I said before, on the one hand, some countries will integrate faster and further. The risk of that is that if they fail to convince the rest to eventually join that vanguard of countries, then the result will be an even more dysfunctional European Union.
Well, I really think that I can say with confidence that our viewers did not expect to be talking about EU voting rules today, but it's just your column was so fascinating because it took this kind of, to be honest, arcane issue. People aren't paying attention to how the EU votes, but puts it in such stark, contrast to the things of how it has real world implications. So, for those of us out there who are watching, if you want to read and hear more about these type of insights, really kind of looking deeply at issues, please check out all of our content at ranenetwork.com, RANE network.com. Otherwise, Adriano, from me in New York to you in Barcelona, hope it's a great weekend.
It was nice talking with you again, Sam. Have a great weekend, and thanks everyone for watching.